Subject is forbidden archaeology. This book that you see on the screen has attracted quite a bit of attention in the scientific world. It's been reviewed in most of the major journals of archaeology and anthropology and the history of science. And I've actually come here, I've interrupted a tour of Europe to come here. I've been speaking at university departments of archaeology and anthropology and biology, and basically when they hear my presentation, it's usually like a riot.
We won't riot.
It's actually quite a change of pace to speak to an audience that's a little bit sympathetic to this kind of evidence. Although I do very much enjoy confronting the mainstream scientists with this kind of evidence. And generally I tell them, at least you should be aware of the entire data set that's relative to your discipline, archaeology. And however you want to divide up that data set, if you think, well, this is useful and this is not useful and this is marginal, that's one thing. But at least they should be aware of it. And I frankly found that many of the graduate students of archaeology that I've been talking to in Europe are surprised that there's so much scientifically reported evidence in their own discipline that they've never heard of, and they're beginning to wonder why. Next slide. My inspiration for that work, which documents evidence for extreme human antiquity, was inspired by my 25 years of study of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And I'm a member of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, which is the science studies branch of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And I think that's one reason why the work has attracted a little bit of attention in the scientific world. Generally, when they encounter some work that has some sort of anti-evolutionary implication to it, they automatically categorize it as coming from a biblical or Christian standpoint. So to have something of this sort coming from an entirely new, for them, direction gives it some novelty and hence some attraction, I think. Now among these ancient Sanskrit writings are a body of literature called the Puranas, or the histories. And they tell us several very interesting things. Next slide. Next one. One thing they tell us is that over the course of vast periods of times, some primitive ape-like humanoid creatures have coexisted with anatomically modern human creatures on this planet. The basic unit of time that these Puranas speak about is called the Day of Brahma. And the Day of Brahma lasts about 4.3 billion years, and it's followed by a Night of Brahma. And during the Day of Brahma, it is said that life is manifest on the earth, and during the Night of Brahma, it's not manifest. And if you look carefully at these ancient Sanskrit cosmological calendars, you'll find we're about 2 billion years into the current day of Brahma. So, say if we had a Vedic archaeologist, what would such an archaeologist expect to find? Well, they'd expect to find signs of life on this planet going back roughly 2 billion years, because that would be the beginning of the current day of Brahma. And it's an interesting coincidence, I find it an interesting coincidence, that according to just even your standard paleontology, the first signs of life on Earth do go back to roughly that period of time, 2 to 3 billion years, when you have the first fossils of the blue-green algae occurring in the fossil record. Of course, our Vedic archaeologists would expect to find not only evidence of very simple creatures like the blue-green algae, but also evidence for more advanced life forms, perhaps even humans, going back perhaps that far, 2 billion years. Of course, that's quite a revolutionary concept for your standard orthodox archaeologist and anthropologist. Next slide. One thing we have to consider when we're looking at the geological record is that it's very incomplete. Geologists will tell us that of all the sedimentary layers that have ever been deposited on the Earth, only about 5 to 10% remain. All the rest have been destroyed by erosion and other geological processes. And of that percentage, that tiny percentage that remains, actually only a tiny fraction of a percentage of that has ever been looked at by geologists, paleontologists, archaeologists, and others. And then each school of researchers has their own particular point of view through which the evidence is filtered. So really what you wind up with is a very fragmentary record. Nevertheless, say our Vedic archaeologist would expect to find a very sparse but nevertheless real record of an anatomically modern human presence on this planet going back roughly 2 billion years. This Vedic archaeologist might also predict that since most of this evidence would be encountered by archaeologists and other scientists who have an entirely different set of assumptions about the nature and origin of life on this planet, that they might tend to edit that record to fit their own evolutionary preconceptions. I don't expect you to be able to read all the fine print here, but basically on the left hand you have the conventional scenario of human origins, where you have life beginning on this planet about 2 billion years ago, the very first apes and monkeys coming into existence about 40 to 50 million years ago, the first hominids, or upright walking human ancestors, about 4 to 5 million years ago, and anatomically modern humans like ourselves coming into existence about 1 or 200,000 years ago, and the first signs of civilization, per se, coming at about 10,000. Now, generally we're told that everything that scientists have discovered over the past 150 years more or less conforms to this basic outline of anatomically modern humans coming into existence rather late in the geological record. But in the 8 years of research that I did with Richard Thompson, we found that over the past 150 years, archaeologists and anthropologists have discovered abundant evidence showing that human beings like ourselves have been present throughout this entire period of time. And I mentioned that the research took me 8 years, and I didn't think it was going to take 8 years. I thought it might take 8 weeks. Because I was aware of some anomalies. And I thought, well, I'll collect a few more, I'll look through the literature, I'll collect a few more, and we'll come out with a little book, maybe 100 pages long, and we'll present this evidence to the world. But I found, as I started looking into it, an incredible body of scientifically reported evidence for extreme human activities. So much so that it took about 8 years to gather it from scientific journals and publications and many different languages from around the world. And this evening, I just want to share with you a representative sample of the kinds of evidence that we encountered and that are reported in the 900 pages of Forbidden Archaeology. Next. Of course, why don't we hear so much about
this evidence is because of what I would call a process of knowledge filtration. The little blue box is the knowledge filter, and the reports of evidence that more or less conform to orthodox scientific ideas, they tend to pass very easily through this filter. If they deviate perhaps slightly from the accepted ideas, they may pass through with some difficulty, but if they radically contradict the accepted ideas, they tend to be rejected in terms of either being forgotten, set aside, ignored, or in some cases actively suppressed. Next. Now one case that I like very much is the case of the California gold mine discoveries. Of course, during the California gold rush days, miners were going to California, and initially they were panning for gold in the rivers, but then they started digging tunnels into the sides of mountains. Next. For example, at Table Mountain in the central Sierra Nevada mountains, the miners were digging tunnels, sometimes thousands of feet through solid rock to get to the gold-bearing deposits. And inside these tunnels, they were finding anatomically modern human skeletons. They were finding spear points. They were finding hundreds of stone tools at many, many different locations, not just in one place. Next. And this is an example of one of the many hundreds of stone tools that were found there. This is stone, mortar, and pestle. Next. The unusual thing about these discoveries is they date to the early Eocene. They would be about 50 million years old. So our Vedic archaeologist wouldn't be surprised by that, because he or she would be, well, expected to find evidence going back even further. Your Orthodox archaeologist would, this couldn't even be considered. This is totally beyond the bounds of what could even be wildly dreamed about as possible. Next. This body of evidence was reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the state geologist of California at the time. He reported it in a book called The Auriferous Gravels of the Sierra Nevadas. Auriferous means gold-bearing. The book was published by Harvard University in 1880. Now, why don't we hear so much about these discoveries today? Next slide. It's largely due to the influence of this gentleman, Dr. William B. Holmes, who was an anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution right here in Washington, D.C. And the Smithsonian Institution has always been a very influential scientific research organization in the United States. In the 19th century, its influence was probably much greater than it is today. So using his position of power and influence, Dr. Holmes said, well, if this Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution as we understand it today, then he would have hesitated to announce his conclusions despite the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. In other words, the evidence, even an imposing array of such evidence, if it goes against an orthodox accepted scientific idea, then it has to be set aside. And essentially that's what happened next. And this is another one of the many stone tools that were found in those gold mines. Now these artifacts are still kept today in the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Natural History at the University of California in Berkeley. And in 1996, I had the fortune to work with a television producer, Bill Cote, of BC Video, to produce a television program which was aired on NBC called The Mysterious Origins of Man. And while they were filming that, I advised them to go to the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Natural History at the University of California at Berkeley and try to get permission to film these particular artifacts, which are stored there. They're not displayed to the public. And the museum officials reacted in very interesting ways. The first thing they said to the producers was, well, you're working on a television
program, you obviously have a very tight deadline. We wouldn't possibly have time to bring these artifacts out for you to film. But the producers told them, no, we have 3 or 4 months, we have plenty of time, so please bring them out. At that point, the museum officials told them, well, we have another problem. We have a staff shortage, we have a very tight budget, we would have to pay our workers overtime to have them bring these artifacts out from storage, so please excuse us. At that point, the producers came back with an offer to pay all of the overtime expenses, any other expenses that would be involved, and then finally, the museum curator just said, no, we're not going to let you film these artifacts. And I suspect the reason is because they thought that the material would probably be used in a way that wasn't in line with their objectives.
Now, it's also very interesting what happened when that television program was aired, because there was unprecedented outrage from the scientific community in the United States and also around the world. It was the first time in history that a major American television network had broadcast a program that really questioned the standard Darwinian concept of human origins. And it was sort of like Pearl Harbor Day for scientists. They had not imagined that any such thing could be possible. If you look in, there's an issue of the journal Science, which is published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They said nothing. They had seen nothing in all the time that they had been watching the scientific community. They'd seen no outpouring of outrage that matched what happened when this particular television show was aired in February of 1996. They have an organization called the National Center for Science Education. And the sole purpose of that organization is to keep the standard orthodox ideas about the evolution of life on this planet intact in the nation's high schools in particular. And the president of that organization said in this particular issue of Science that the telephones in his offices were ringing off the hook because biology teachers from all over the United States were calling because their students were asking them questions they couldn't answer after they'd seen this television program. Now, if you can just imagine the level of outrage that was there after the program aired the first time, it increased several orders of magnitude when the scientific community discovered that NBC was going to rebroadcast the program in June. Now, at that point, if any of you were on the internet, say monitoring the groups like Archaeology, Anthropology, Talk Origins, and many of the other scientific discussion groups, at that point you would have seen literally thousands of messages being exchanged. And of course, many of them were about forbidden archaeology. Actually, there was one very astute scientist, when he heard the initial advertisements for this television program, Mysterious Origins of Man, talking about evidence for extreme human antiquity going back millions and millions of years, he put a message on the internet before the show was broadcast saying, I predict that this television program was sponsored by this nasty book, Forbidden Archaeology. It's not coming from the Christian creationists. It's so after the program came out, he was very proud to say he was correct. But what happened when the scientific community learned that this program was going to be broadcast a second time is they began a very intense letter writing campaign to attempt to force General Electric, which is the company that owns NBC, to force NBC not to show the program again. They also began a very well-organized attempt to pressure the sponsors to withdraw their sponsorship of the program. And it was very interesting how NBC reacted. I think taking the example of Velikovsky, back in the 1950s. I think if this sort of thing had happened 10 or 15 years ago, this kind of campaign would have succeeded in keeping the program off the air. However, there seems to be some kind of change going on in the world because NBC responded by simply using, well, their publicity for the second showing of the program was to tell the American people, watch the television program that the scientists don't want you to see. So now, then, if the level of outrage was already at a peak, it became very shrill after that. There was shrieking. And what, now this is, you might find this pretty amazing, but Dr. Allison R. Palmer, who is the head of the Institute for Cambrian Studies, actually attempted to give the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to punish NBC for having broadcast this film. And it wasn't an isolated effort on his part. It was it was a very public effort, and he broadcast his message all over the internet to all of the scientific discussion groups. And he had the support of many people within the scientific community. So here's what he asked the Federal Communications Commission to do: to publicly censure NBC for having broadcast Mysterious Origins of Man. He wanted the FCC to direct NBC to broadcast numerous public apologies and retractions for having aired the program. And plus he wanted NBC fined several $1 million. And that money was to be put into a public trust fund to put proper television programming.
No steak, no faggots?
Yeah. Well, that's, generally we're told that science operates in a very objective way, and I'm sure they would have liked to have burned everyone connected with the show at the stake if they could possibly have arranged that. Now, it's just another example of this knowledge filtration process, which is ongoing. So when I tell people, scientists in Europe about this, they find it very amazing. They can't believe it's true, but I've given them the documentation. And I'm documenting all of this in a book that's coming out in the spring of 1998. It's called Forbidden Archaeology's Impact. And you'll find all of the relevant documents for this in that book. Now, but these California discoveries, they're down in this period here, as I said, 40 to 50 million years ago, when according to your standard accounts, you should have had only the very first primitive apes and monkeys existing. Next. Now people wonder, are things still being discovered today? They say, well, perhaps in the 19th century, some foolish geologist in California might have uncovered something. But it couldn't be happening today. But it is happening today. In 1979, Mary Leakey and her co-workers uncovered at a site called Lake Toli in the East African country of Tanzania tracks of footprints, many dozens of footprints, several different tracks, several different individuals. All of the physical anthropologists who have studied these prints have concluded that they're indistinguishable from anatomically modern human footprints. They've analyzed the size, the heel structure, the toes, the ball of the foot. Everything is anatomically modern. The unusual thing about them is they're found in volcanic ash, roughly 4 million years old. Now, our Vedic archaeologists wouldn't be surprised to find evidence for anatomically modern humans existing in East Africa 4 million years ago. Your Orthodox archaeologists would find it somewhat astounding. perhaps not as astounding as evidence for a human presence in California 50 million years ago, but nevertheless, somewhat astounding. Next. Now, what is the usual explanation that's given for these footprints? The usual explanation is there must have existed in East Africa 4 million years ago some kind of ape man that had feet exactly like ours, and that's how we got the prints. Well, another suggestion is the creature must have had longer toes and was walking with them scrunched up underneath, kind of like this. But that doesn't fly. You don't see those knuckle prints there. But in any case, this proposal that there must have been some kind of ape man with very modern feet existing in East Africa 4 million years ago, it's a very interesting proposal. Unfortunately, there's no physical evidence at this point to back that idea up, because they have the fossil bones of the ape men that they think existed at that time, the Australopithecines, Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy. And they have a fairly complete foot skeleton from one of the Australopithecus afarensis individuals. And that foot couldn't have made the prints that were found at Lake Tolly. For one thing, the toes of Australopithecus are about 1.5 times longer than the average human toe, and there are several other differences in the foot structure as well. So today, the only creature known to science that could make a footprint like the prints that were found at Lake Tolly is a human being like ourselves. Next. This is another one of the footprints. Next. Now, as I said, in forbidden archaeology, I looked at anomalous archaeological evidence going back, well, 150 years, basically. And a lot of the evidence in the book is from the earlier periods, from the 19th century, and some of it is from more recent times. It was a very interesting phenomenon. When archaeologists look at evidence from the 19th century that goes along with their particular view of things, they call it great pioneering scientific work, a masterpiece of archaeology or anthropology. But when they encounter evidence from the 19th century that goes against their accepted ideas, they tend to respond by, well, what did they know in the 19th century? We've advanced so far since then. So that's why I sometimes like to stress in my presentations to archaeologists and anthropologists some of the more recent cases, just to provide an antidote to that allergic reaction they have to 19th century anomalous evidence. Now this is the site at Huayatlaco in central Mexico near the town of Puebla. And the story there is that in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, anthropologists were conducting excavations, and at the bottom of their excavations they found stone tools of a very advanced type. And of course they wanted to know how old these particular tools were, so they invited a team of geologists to come and date the layers of rock in which the artifacts were found next. And one of the geologists who came was Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre, and she and her colleagues used 4 different methods: the uranium series method, fission track method, other methods. And each method that they used independently gave them an age of roughly 250 to 300,000 years as the age of this particular site. And that was unusual for 2 reasons. First of all, there shouldn't have been any human beings anywhere in the world capable of making the kinds of tools that were found at this particular site until 100,000 years ago. And what to speak of North America, the standard ideas about the peopling of the New World are that human beings only entered North America at a maximum of 30,000 years ago. So here you have evidence for anatomically modern humans in Mexico at 300,000 years ago. The anthropologists in charge of the site were not prepared to accept that kind of date for the site. So they ignored what the geologists told them, and instead they published an age of about 20,000 years for the site. And that age was derived from a carbon-14 dating of a piece of shell that was found at another site 5 miles away from the Huayatlaco site. So it's another example of this process of knowledge filtration, which is ongoing. And Dr. McIntyre, because she stuck to her guns, she just wouldn't cave in to the anthropologists. She attempted to get her reports published in other journals. She found that she suffered professionally from that, so much so that she had to leave her profession of geology for many years. Now, when I published Forbidden Archaeology, that kind of woke her up a little bit, and she's become active again and has recently gone down again to this site, Huayatlaco, to gather more samples and make another attempt to see what she can do to convince her colleagues in the scientific world that we really do have some evidence for a human presence at 300,000 years in North America. We'll see what happens with that. Next. Now these are some illustrations of some of the stone tools that were found at this Huayatlaco site. And initially I wanted to use photographs of these tools in this particular publication. But when I wrote to the anthropologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, who was the chief anthropologist in charge of the excavations, she told me she would only give me permission to use photographs of the stone tools if I would promise that I would not mention the date of 300,000 years obtained by Virginia Steen McIntyre for that particular site. Of course, I wouldn't give any such statement, and I just had some illustrations made of the tools. Next. So there have been a lot of anomalously old discoveries of stone tools made throughout the world, and these are reported in the scientific literature, and these discoveries were actively discussed at scientific conferences, but they've simply been dropped unfairly, I think, from the active discussion in the discipline of archaeology. Now, these are just representative of several hundred stone tools that were found by Carlos Ribeiro, who was the head of the Geological Survey of Portugal in the last century. He found these implements near Lisbon, and they occurred in Miocene formations. So they were early to middle Miocene, which means they would be roughly 15 to 20 million years old. Next. And there's another interesting set of discoveries made by the Abbé Bourgeois in France at a site called Tenay. And here again, you have stone tools occurring in geological formations about 20 million years old. Next. Similar discoveries were made by a German geologist attached to the Geological Survey of India, again in the last century. This was Dr. Fritz Nördling, and he found stone tools, again, of Miocene age in Burma. They would be roughly 20 million years old. Next. So, as I said, I'm just giving a few of the many hundreds of cases that I could give from the scientific literature. But we can see it's adding up to quite a little body of evidence, just here in a few minutes. And we have the California discoveries at 40 to 50 million years old. These numerous discoveries of stone tools about 20 million years old in various parts of the world. The Lake Tolly footprints at 4 to 5 million years old. So it's already adding up to quite a little body of evidence just in the little time we spent here. Next. Now, how far back in time could we possibly go with this kind of evidence? There's an interesting report from a scientific journal called The Geologist, published in 1862. And it told of a complete anatomically modern human skeleton that was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County, Illinois. And above, directly above the skeleton, was an unbroken layer of slate rock several feet thick. Now generally when archaeologists hear about some kind of anatomically modern human skeleton being found in some very old layers, they immediately say, well, it must have been some kind of intrusive burial. In other words, a few thousand years ago, some Indians were there. One of their members died. They dug a hole. They buried the body, and therefore, that's how it got there. But it really doesn't belong in the layer of earth in which it was found. That kind of explanation doesn't appear to apply in a case like this, because generally speaking, the Indians weren't burying their skeletons 90 feet below the surface of the ground, and if they had, they would have had to have broken through the layer of slate rock, which, according to the reports, was unbroken at the time the skeleton was found. Next. Now, up to now, I've been giving you reports which come from the scientific literature exclusively. But in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I also include an appendix of evidence, reports of similar evidence from other sources. And we should expect that if evidence for extreme human antiquity really is there in the layers of the earth, then people other than professional scientists must be encountering it. And of course, when they encounter it, it might be reported in some kind of literature other than the standard scientific literature, in other words, in newspapers and magazines and things of that sort. So we should really expect to find such reports, and indeed, they are there. I chose this one because it goes along with the previous report, which is from a scientific journal. This is a newspaper report from the 1890s about Mrs. Culp, who was in the town of Morrisonville, Illinois, and she was putting a big piece of coal into her coal-burning stove, and she broke open the piece of coal and found inside it a gold chain. Now, from that newspaper report, it was possible to determine what mine the coal actually came from. So, when we were doing the research for Forbidden Archaeology, we contacted the State Geological Survey of Illinois, and we asked them, well, how old is the coal in this particular mine? And they told us, roughly 300 million years. So it's kind of interesting. You have that anatomically modern human skeleton and the gold chain from the state of Illinois and geological deposits 300 million years old. Now, Vedic archaeologists wouldn't be surprised about that. He or she might expect to find even older, more extreme evidence for a human presence. Next. Now, this is an article from Scientific American, which tells of a metallic vase that was blown out of solid rock at a depth of 15 feet in Dorchester, Massachusetts, near Boston. Next. Just a little graphic I made of the artifact being blown out of the solid rock. From the report, it's possible to tell that that rock is known to modern geologists as the Roxbury conglomerate. And the U.S. Geological Survey says that that particular formation is about 500 million years old. Next. So now we're getting back down into this area. And we have reports from 500 million years, 300 million years, 50 million years, 45 million years, on up. And we do see also that there's apparently some kind of editing process going on, whereby this record here is translated into what you see on the left-hand side. So basically it appears that, well, the two predictions that our Vedic archaeologists would be making, namely that such evidence for extreme human antiquity really does exist, and that because the people who discover it have entirely different conceptions about human origins, that they would edit it. Seems like both of those predictions really come true if you really look at the history of archaeology and what's actually been found and what's happened to the reports of what's actually been found. Next. So this has some anti-Darwinian implications. Next. Oh, just one other little item. This is an example of some of many hundreds of metallic spheres that were found by miners in South Africa. And this particular example is very interesting because of the three parallel grooves that it has around its equator. This particular object, it was kept in the Museum of Natural History in Klerksdorp, South Africa, and the curator of the museum, Rolf Marx, sent me some reporting about it. Nothing's been published in the scientific literature about this, but this particular specimen had been tested. He told me that it was extremely hard, that it couldn't be scratched with a steel point, which means it's about as hard as a diamond, really. And when the television program Mysterious Origins of Man was being filmed, we wanted to go to South Africa and film this particular specimen, but Rolf Marx told us that it had been stolen from the museum by what he called a white witch, which kind of adds a paranormal element to the whole thing. But I do happen to have here another specimen. It only has one groove around it. And what I want to do is pass this around. I do want it back.
What kind of metal is it?
Well, you have a look at it.
Like an alloy?
Some people.
I just call it metal.
It appears to be a naturally occurring form of iron called hematite. But it's interesting that it hasn't oxidized, however. Next. So this body of evidence, it does have some anti-evolutionary implications to it. What the evidence appears to suggest is that human beings like ourselves have coexisted with other primates and hominids on this planet for vast periods of time, which always leads to the question, well, if we didn't get here by some material process of evolution on this planet, then how did we arrive here? And that's a question that I want to get into in my next book, which I'm calling Human Devolution. And especially when I speak to scientific audiences, as I have been doing for the past couple of months, and as I will be doing when I depart from here. I'll be going to Hungary for a tour of the universities in Hungary. Generally, there are loud demands. When I present evidence that goes against the accepted ideas, there are loud demands for an alternative explanation of human origins. And I really don't think I'm obligated to supply one. Just logically. We could just admit, well, we don't know, which seems to be anathema. You cannot, a scientifically minded person cannot just say, well, we don't know, we don't have a theory, we don't know. There's always this demand, well, if Darwin was wrong, then now you must, because you're challenging the idea that you must give an alternative right now. And what I generally tell them is I don't feel obligated to do so. If we actually agree that there's a lot of evidence that contradicts the accepted idea, if we actually agree on that, both you and I, then why don't you give an alternative explanation?
Or a joint alternative.
Yeah, or a joint one. Or why don't we just admit that we don't know? But given that it's customary, I guess it's customary that the person who challenges or provides evidence that looks like it falsifies some accepted doctrine, it's customary that the person who does that give some alternative explanation. Well, of course I am prepared to do that. But generally what I tell these audiences is, well, the first thing is we have to change some of our basic assumptions about the nature of reality. Because if we stick to the assumptions that underlie much of current science, namely that everything can be reduced to matter operating to certain physical and chemical laws, if we stick with that basic assumption, then that really limits the kinds of alternative explanations that you can offer. So the first thing that I try to do is convince them there's some very good reasons for supposing that we may have to change some of our fundamental assumptions about how nature really works. In other words, if we want to understand where human beings have come from, we should first understand what a human being really is. And I'll just briefly outline the approach I want to take to this in my next book, Human Evolution. Basically, it appears that human beings are composed of three things. Not just human beings, but all living things. A body made of gross physical matter, of the kind that we're accustomed to deal with scientifically. Then that has there's also a conscious self that apparently can exist apart from matter. And there also appears to be an intermediate set of energies that we might call mental energies. And that's what we are. We're a combination of all three things: matter, mind, and consciousness or spirit, if you prefer that term. And I think there's quite a body of evidence that supports that. And that gets you into what we might call the hidden history of physics. For example, many people aren't aware that Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, for example, who discovered radium and got the Nobel Prize for that, were heavily involved in psychical research and paranormal research. They were part of a circle of French scientists that investigated the Italian medium Eusebia Palladino earlier in this century. And they were convinced that her psychokinetic phenomena were genuine. I presented a talk on the hidden history of physics last year at the Science University in Budapest at the Department of Nuclear Physics there. I shared the podium with a British Nobel laureate physicist, Maurice Wilkins. He talked about physics and ethics. I talked about the hidden history of physics. And I was really surprised when the head of the physics department of a major European university came to me after the talk and said he really appreciated it. And that, although his main work was as a plasma physicist, on the side he was doing experiments in telepathy. Now, in other words, there's a whole body of evidence which we could get into that tends to show that, well, maybe we do need to change some of our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, and that will allow us to offer an explanation of human origins that, well, I would call evolution. In other words, we haven't evolved up by some material process on this planet, but we devolved from some higher dimensional position in the cosmos, and we kind of been covered over by denser energies, and were ultimately meant to free ourselves from that entanglement. But that's a subject of another book. Thank you.
The skeleton that was found below the shale, I believe, how old was that, and are all those spheres approximately the same size?
The skeleton, well, the two questions were, what was the age of the skeleton found below the layer of slate rock? That's about 300 million years old, according to the reports from the Geological Survey of Illinois about the age of the deposits in which that was found. And the spheres are the metallic spheres found in South Africa. Those are of different sizes. They range from, say, a couple inches in diameter to maybe about 3/4 to half an inch in diameter. And the internet discussions that occurred after those were shown on this television program, Mysterious Origins of Man, several geologists said, well, obviously they're just natural formations. They occur all over, even the lines. So then I asked them, I publicly asked, all right, send me a photograph, send me a specimen of a naturally occurring metallic sphere with grooves around the equator, and nobody could do it. And so that's interesting. So we'll gradually go across here. Yes?
The dating of the geological formations has been questioned for 25 years.
That I'm aware of, there are professional geologists, professional physicists who are highly concerned that a 25 million year old date or a 300 million year old date is based upon faulty assumptions elsewhere, giving faulty dates for ages. Are you dealing with that in some way?
So the question has to do with the reliability of the geological dating methods. And in Forbidden Archaeology, we point out that all of those methods could very well be wrong. But if you're going to have a discussion about fossil evidence for human antiquity, it has to take place within some kind of framework. So, although, as you say, all of those methods could be completely wrong, in terms of having a discussion with orthodox scientists who accept those dating methods, just for the sake of argument, we presented it like that. In other words, you say these layers are this old. How do you explain the presence of these artifacts or these bones in those particular layers? Now, one way to do that is to throw out all of the standard geological dating methods, which is, I would be prepared to accept that if that's what they want to propose. In other words, then you wouldn't have any science of paleontology, you wouldn't have any way of judging the history of life on this planet from the fossil evidence. And we would just want to say, well, we can't discuss the origin of the human race or any other species on the basis of evidence that's found in the layers of the earth, then because it's all the dating is suspect, then I'm prepared to accept that particular result. Yes?
Some years ago, the Fortean organization published some stories about
Like a spark plug found inside a geode. I haven't read your book. Maybe you discussed that. Are you aware of that?
I was aware of it, but I included in the book only things that I could get some very, very exact information about where they were found, what geological formation they were actually found in, to determine how old they are. Because otherwise, unless there's some kind of age determination, it wasn't possible to really use it.
But if it's true, these geodes weren't made yesterday. So it would be old, let's put it like that. You know,
Yeah. But I had some criteria that I applied, and I'm not saying that those aren't genuine. It's just that I had a certain, given the audiences that I was attempting to influence, and really this book has attracted the attention of the audiences that I directed it to. I had to apply some kind of standards, and didn't meet the standards that I had set, for inclusion in the book. It's not that I think that it's definite, but those discoveries aren't worthy of attention and that they're not genuine. But I just needed a little bit more to include them in the book. Next.
Am I mistaken, or is here that the older the artifact, the more sophisticated it is?
Perhaps on the basis of the few examples that I've shown, you could draw a conclusion like that. But if you look at the entire body of evidence, say if you go through the chart that's in the back of Forbidden Archaeology, the whole body, that it would be a little more difficult to make a case like that. Yes?
Yeah, you're probably familiar with the possibility that the ape actually evolved from man. Recent book, about 10 years ago, called The Monkey Puzzle, but it's based on molecular biology, to make a good case for that.
Broken with body.
Yeah.
That's how they got it.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, but the assumption from the report is that it was undisturbed when they went
Prior to the
down.
discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably familiar with the possibility that the ape actually evolved from man. Recent book, about 10 years ago, called The Monkey Puzzle, but it's based on molecular biology, to make a good case for that. That some apes actually evolved from man rather than vice versa. Blavatsky mentioned this about 100 years ago, that man was the progenitor of the apes rather than vice versa.
I'm familiar with those ideas, and then, but see, I think one thing that I've noticed is that, say, scientists are very proud today, and say in the field of astronomy, that they've gotten beyond what they call geocentrism. People used to think everything was centered on the Earth, the universe was centered on the Earth, and then they discovered, no, we're just some minor planet. But as far as their whole idea about the origin of life goes, it's still quite geocentric. And it's also very reductionistic and materialistic. According to the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, you can make a very good case for what you're saying, because the story there that you find about the origin of the species is the result of a process of descent with modification from demigods operating on higher levels of the universe, where apparently they had bijas, or seeds, and they would engage in reproductive processes, gods and goddesses using these seeds. And by some kind of manipulations, they were able to produce the different species, including the human beings, the monkeys, and the others. So, of course, those demigods are daemons. They would be very human-like in form, and some of them were producing, according to these accounts, monkeys, plants, animals, and other things too. In the back.
With regard to the less than warm receptions of your work that you mentioned, was your association with Bhaktivedanta or ISKCON or any of this brought up?
Well, first of all the receptions weren't entirely negative, even from the mainstream scientific community. For example, there was a 20-page review article about forbidden archaeology published in Social Studies of Science by Dr. David Oldroyd, who's a very famous historian of science and one of his graduate students. And they said, does this book,
make a contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? And they said yes, for two reasons. They said, first, nobody's gone into the subject matter in such depth before. And second, they said the book raises important questions about the nature of scientific truth claims. So from your standard scholars, I think that's about as much as you can expect. So there was, and also say there was Kenneth Fader, who wrote in Geoarchaeology. He said, this book is anti-evolutionism, but it's a kind of anti-evolutionism that we had never seen before. He said you could call it Krishna creationism with no disrespect intended. And he said it differs from any other kind of literature like that he'd ever seen before, and that it was well written, it was scholarly, that it used original sources and things like that. So a lot of so it's not that all the reactions were negative, and even the connections with the Bhaktivedanta Institute weren't all negative. On the other hand, you had people like Jonathan Marks in American Journal of Physical Anthropology saying, "Oh, this is trash. This is garbage. This is Hinduite creationist drivel." So you get this division between what I would call the fundamentalist Darwinian element and, say, the more objective people, even within the scientific community. Yes.
You're not required to come up with an alternate explanation, but since you have, I think it's fair to kind of question you on how that relates to the how good it is. And I think you were saying something about the postulate that you have humans or body, mind, and spirit. I don't know how far back in the evolutionary or animal kingdom you want to go with this. The one-celled animals have this characteristic. And how does that explain or account for the artifacts or the remains that are seen to be show that humans seem to exist prior to when the conventional theory of evolution would date?
In how many words? Actually, to fully answer all the questions that you just raised, I think you recognize it would take quite a long time to do that. But just simply, I don't think the alternative that I'm proposing, that any of the questions that you raised poses any big problem for them. As far as how far down on the scale of living beings do we want to go with this division between, okay, this will be the last question? Okay. How far do we want to go down? I would say, yeah, well, even those microbes, they also have that tripartite division.
But how does that explain the other question about how can it explain that tripartite system, explain how you could get humans existing many millions of years ago? The physical body is what we find evidence for. How does the physical human...
Well, according, as I said, I'm taking my cue from the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, and they would say that there are vast cycles of creation and destruction in which these things repeatedly happen, and in the last sequence it would have begun about 2 billion years ago. So, based on that assumption, I would expect to find that kind of evidence going back about 2 billion years on this planet, which apparently it does. Thank you very much.